Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for taking your time to attend Washoku, Japanese Cuisine Registration as UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage 10th Anniversary Symposium. To start, we have the seminar by Dr. Johnny Drain, titled The Power of Fermentation in Japanese Cuisine. Dr. Drain is a material scientist and fermentation expert. He is a co-founder of WinWin Food Labs and Mold Magazine. Dr. Drain, over to you.
Hey everyone. So my name's Dr. Johnny Drain, and today I'm going to talk to you about, the power of fermentation in Japanese food and my experience of that. So, as the introducer said, I co-founded a magazine called This Is Mold, and also am the co-founder of a company called WinWin Food Labs. But I basically started off as a scientist, a material scientist. Now, lots of people don't know what a material scientist is, but it's kind of a combination between chemistry and physics. And material scientists look at the world and look what the world is made of, and they say, what is that? And can I change the properties of that? Can I improve that? And actually, that is what cooks do, and chefs do, and bartenders do. They look at a slice of bread and they say, if I toast that into toast, it will have different properties. It will taste differently. So I went, having finished a PhD in this highfalutin material science, on a journey through food, essentially, and have worked exploring the physics, the chemistry, and the biology that underpins lots of the amazing foods that we eat. And so if you take something as simple as an ice cream or an ice lolly, there's lots of quite complex, actually, chemistry and physics that underpins that and dictates why we find these sorts of foods, chocolate as well, so delicious. And I've had the great pleasure to work with lots of very fancy pants restaurants all over the world. So people like Noma. I was part of something called the Nordic Food Lab for a period back in 2014. On a boat outside the restaurant, experimenting with lots of wonderful things, some of which were fermented. And it was there that I got my first taste of Aspergillus oryzae koji, which we can talk about a little bit later. I've worked with amazing people like Mauro Colagreco. I think he was part of the visit in 2008 over to Kikinoya and to Japan. Beautiful restaurant down on the Côte d'Azur. And I visited them a few times, and we've played with, some European ferments. So can you make butter from goat milk and goat cream? And yes, you can, but it can get messy. And I've also done projects at Alchemist, another fancy restaurant in Copenhagen. And this was to do with, can you get materials, foods, this piece of paper with some insects on it was made of carrots, and we structured it in a certain way that when you poured a broth over it, it rolled up. And so this idea that the food that we eat can change shape and change functionality when we cook it or when we eat it. And so this is what my suitcase looks like. So I travel around the world, and needless to say, I get stopped at security an awful lot. And sometimes I get arrested. I've been arrested once. I can tell you that story after the talk if you want. But lots of these things that I travel with are ferments, and they're inspired by Japanese ferments, miso, soy sauces. Some of these have exploded in my bags, and I have a fairly expensive pair of white jeans that got covered in a miso paste, and I've never worn them since. But this is sort of what I do. I travel around, I talk about fermentation, and I help people unlock the power of deliciousness through fermentation. And these are some of the amazing people that I've worked with in the past. So fermentation, this thing of fermentation, what is fermentation? It's cooking with microbes. That's a fairly accurate but simple description. It shaped my approach to food, and so has Japan. I was very lucky back in 2014, 2015, with Saito-san, who's in the room, to make a few trips to Japan. Some of the classics, Kyoto, Tokyo, but also some prefectures like Toyama and Mie, which are a little bit off the beaten track. And there I met all of these wonderful people. These ladies taught me how to make the type of miso that they made. These ladies were slightly younger, I think only in their early 70s, and they taught me how to make another different type of miso. We visited producers who make sukemono, so takuanzuke, and these barrels are 6 foot, and this lady was sort of jumping up this ladder and jumping in. So There she is digging the pickles out, and then she served them to us. We visited Toshijima, an island off the coast near Toba, where seafood is an incredibly rich and essential part of their food traditions, whether it's seaweed or seafood and little fishes that were fermented. And Toyama, which probably lots of people, well, maybe if you're not Japanese, might not be aware of, but it's on the sort of west coast, and it has a very deep bay, an unusually deep bay around which the city is situated. And as a result of this unusual geological feature, you get these types of seafood there that you don't find anywhere else. So you get these incredible shiroebi, these little white glass shrimp, which are a phenomenal and beautiful delicacy. I've also had the good fortune to visit lots of sake producers. So sake, a spirit made with fermented rice, again using koji, which we can talk about a little bit later. But on all of these trips, in all of these different parts of Japan, there is this rich, deep, and so deep that it's unstated connection with fermentation and biology, this power of microbes, microorganisms to transform our foods and either make things more delicious, to preserve them, sometimes to detoxify things. You can have fermented pufferfish fugu eggs, which if you eat them fresh they would kill you, but they're fermented for 2-3 years and the poisons break down. This lady who taught us how to make amazake, which is I suppose analogous to sake but with a lower alcohol content. So I came across all of these incredible fermented Japanese foods, and as a kid I grew up in Birmingham, not well known as a sort of gastronomic capital even of England, if you can imagine that. But anyway, we had soy sauce, Sharwood soy sauce or Amoy soy sauce out of a bottle, and that was probably the closest I'd come to any of these things. But as I started going on these trips, I got to become more familiar with the full breadth of shoyu and the full breadth of miso, all these wonderful different varieties of sake, of mirin, of amazake, of things like natto and sukemono, katsuobushi I didn't put up here, but also this incredible powerhouse that informs so much of the things that you are tasting when you eat Japanese food or food in Japan. But the question is, like, why do we ferment? Like, it's cool as an academic exercise to ferment, but what's the point of all of this? What do we get when we ferment? And when we look at Japanese food and Japanese fermentation, and some of those examples, well, fermentation actually gives us access to lots of things that we wouldn't otherwise have. So as Dr. Ninomiya has already talked about, fermentation gives us access to umami, or lots of different sources of umami. It's not the only route to umami, but it's one of them. So we get access to glutamates and these 5' nucleotides. When we think about amazake and sake, we get access to functional compounds. We get access to ethanol, this stuff that when we drink it, we imbibe it, makes us feel a bit funny, makes us feel a bit dizzy sometimes. Gives us access to various organic acids through the fermentation. We can break down carbohydrates, big macromolecules, into simple sugars. So again, if we refer back to koji, we start off with starchy rice, and we end up with, if you've ever eaten fresh koji, you end up with this delicious, slightly sweet rice grain. This transformation has been enacted by the fermentation. We get access to stability, so we can preserve with fermentation. And then, more than anything, we have this access to flavor. I think probably we could get access to all of these things. I mean, some people might argue that there are types of alcohol that are not delicious, but we still make them and drink them. But more than anything, fermentation helps us create delicious things, and that's what or I believe has made fermentation, whether it's in Japan or elsewhere in the world, these traditions, these techniques, these food ingredients, so kind of loved and so sticky, and fundamentally such a deep part of our food cultures, whether in England or Japan or elsewhere. You don't have to look too far in your cupboard or in your, probably what most of you have already eaten today, to find something that is or has been fermented. So, I made these visits, and which were 10 years ago now. But I've really drawn a lot of inspiration from these Japanese fermentation techniques, so I wanted to talk about a couple of these and just show how these ideas can cross-pollinate. So if you visit Japan, you might come across something called shiokara, which is quite a broad family of foods, but they're basically salted and fermented innards, viscera of seafood. So it might be fish innards, or it might be sort of shellfish innards. And typically they're fermented with about 10% salt. And if you're using fish innards, then you might not need to use another source of enzymes of koji, because there are enzymes inside the fish guts. But if you're not, then you might add some malted rice, add some koji to help that breakdown process. This stuff can be quite strong and punchy and pungent, good with a glass of alcohol. But I've done a lot of work with an amazing guy called Douglas McMaster. He has a restaurant called Silo in London. It's the world's first zero-waste restaurant, a restaurant essentially without a bin. And they had an amazing cuttlefish dish on the menu there. And so they were going through all of this cuttlefish, and they were paring it down and saving the trim, these kind of black ink sacs. And so we had to figure out, can we do something delicious with all of this cuttlefish trim? So we took inspiration from shiokara, and there are other references, fish sauces from Southeast Asia, garums, which are Roman but probably came from North Africa, and we decided to turn these cuttlefish innards, which are this jet black color, into this garum, which is basically like a sort of Hackney Wick version of the shiokara, Hackney Wick version of a fish sauce. And then Doug and the team turned it into this very beautifully simple and elegant leek dish. And so when we make that fish sauce, whether we use sort of cuttlefish, or whether you're using fish innards to make shiokara, or whether you're in Thailand and you're making a Thai fish sauce, you're fundamentally leaning into the same kind of processes. So you're starting with these proteins that are in the fish muscle, and you're using these microbes to break down using enzymes, so using proteases, which are things that these microbes produce, break down these large chain proteins into simpler, smaller molecules like amino acids. And glutamate is one of these amino acids that Dr. Ninomiya spoke about earlier. So whether we're doing shiokara, whether we're doing hipster Hackney Wick, cuttlefish garum, we're sort of following the same science pathways. We've also taken great inspiration from Japanese pickles. Ooh, oh dear. So, sukemono, again, a very big branch of Japanese sort of cuisine and food, and lots of meals. You sit down and you'll get a plate of pickles in Japan, and they can have all sorts of different starting points. But when you compare it to Western pickles, there's often a question around, what is the difference? And so, in let's say Northern Europe, where we are, we have a tradition of making fermented pickles like sukemono, so sauerkraut from Germany and similar areas. But we also have a tradition of vinegar pickling, where you would make vinegar and then you would stick your vegetables inside that vinegar to preserve it. So they actually do both involve fermentation, but with the vinegar pickle, which is what you'll find if you go into a fish and chip shop, that the sort of fermenting has already been done. But there are analogues within Western food. This is a little beautiful pickle plate that we made at Ryan, who's in the middle there, his restaurant Cub, which is also a very kind of a very beautiful restaurant, which focused on luxury and marrying that with sustainability. We used to make lots of pickles there and lean into incredibly Japanese techniques. So misozuki, so we would make a miso, or our version of a miso, with the waste bread, the bread that wasn't eaten, and then we would bury these beautiful little Tokyo turnips and end up with something like that, a little delicious morsel to start off a meal with, or a master class or something. And these are more pickles that we made at 180 Studios. So when we talk about pickles, we're talking about lactic acid bacteria. So we start with our form of lactic acid bacteria. They might be on your hands, they might be on your hair, they might be on the surface, the outer surface of the cabbage. They are everywhere in our world, whether we're here in England or in Uruguay or Bangladesh. And these lactic acid bacteria feed on the sugars in these vegetables that we've given examples of, and they produce lactic acid, so that's why pickles have this lovely tang. And they produce these secondary metabolites, which is basically a fancy sciencey word for saying, stuff that's flavors and delicious things. And I wanted to finish up by giving this example of nare sushi. So this is a sort of proto sushi, which was made before modern sushi. So people would first salt fish to sort of preserve it and dry it out a little bit, and they would pack it inside rice, and salt and the rice would mix, and you get this lactic acid fermentation. It would lower the pH, and so it would preserve this fish, so you could have this nare sushi. So instead of having seasonal fish, which of course you could dry it, you could smoke it, but didn't have such a long shelf life, using nare sushi, you could preserve this delicious abundance of Japanese fish for many, many months. So I'm just drawing to the end of my talk, and I suppose the question that was set to me by the organisers was, why has fermentation, or can we ask that question? Why has fermentation shaped Japanese cuisine so much? Now, these are definitely not hard and fast answers. This is not my specialist subject, but they're speculations which I think have some degree of validity. So first of all, Japan is well renowned for having this distinct seasonality. Like Britain, we're also fortunate to have this distinct seasonality. And so there's a desire where you're used to having amazing ingredients, but only for a short little bursts of the year. There's this, if you're a cook, if you love food, there's this desire to try and preserve that. So I think that's why fermentation lends itself well to Japanese food and food culture. Secondly, humidity, not all, but lots of parts of Japan are very humid, and again, in humid conditions, you need to find ways to preserve. Thirdly, again, like Britain, there's lots of similarities between Britain and Japan. I think you're surrounded by the sea, and the sea has lots of two things: it's got water, it's got salt, it's minerals. But if you have an abundance of incredible sea salt, a very good way to use that is in lots of forms of fermentation. Of course, not all ferments use salt, but lots of them are lactic acid ones that we're talking about, and that is usually. Fourthly, it goes without saying, taste. If you've discovered this toolkit of making all of this delicious food stuff, all of these delicious ingredients, which we mentioned at the top, if you make them and they're so delicious, no wonder that people would keep on making them and perfecting them in the way they have done throughout the shores of Japan. These are the kind of more speculative ones. So Japan has gone through periods of vegetarianism. So the Tokugawa shogun around the 17th century, meat, as I understand it, I'm very happy to be corrected, but was outlawed for a period. And so, people in that time would have grown up eating meat and then suddenly it was outlawed. And so fermentation, one of the really interesting things it gives us in the sort of food tech world at the minute, lots of people are using fermentation to create meaty flavors from non-meaty things as we as a world try to eat a little bit less meat. So I'm really curious about that idea of, in these vegetarian periods, people using these fermentation techniques to try and get access to these meaty flavors that perhaps have been outlawed or forbidden and they weren't in principle supposed to be doing or using. And then finally, and I think it's been mentioned already today that by Hayashi-san, that Japanese cuisine is a water-based cuisine. This is a crude description of Japanese cuisine, but so forgive me, but the sort of one of the key aims is to flavor the water. Again, if you're using so much water, you need that water to be delicious, and that's why we have things like dashi, katsuobushi. So lots of these fermentation techniques give us these amazing ways to very readily, very easily impart flavor to water. Japanese food typically, not exclusively, doesn't have a lot of fat, but through fermentation we can create all of these molecules, these flavor compounds, which we can then impart, dissolve, etc., infuse into water. And so I think that is also perhaps a reason why fermentation and Japanese cuisine have been such good bedfellows for such a long time. So I wanted to say just thanks to the organisers today, lots of amazing chefs and scientists in the room, and it's an honour to be asked to talk to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Drain.